How does a war involving over 20 countries and millions of casualties become the forgotten war? That's the story of Korea. The Korean War was a brutal, three-year conflict that reshaped the world, yet it's often overlooked. Wedged between World War II and Vietnam, nearly 2 million Americans, joined by troops from 16 other nations under the United Nations flag, while hundreds of thousands to support North Korea. The devastation was immense. Cities, families torn apart, millions of civilians lost. But the war ended not with victory, but with an unequal army. In today's world. The roots of the Korean War trace back to 1945, when Japan's defeat left Korea's fate in Allied hands. The US and Soviet Union split the peninsula at the 38th parallel, meant as a temporary measure, but it quickly hardened into a Cold War frontier. In the north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung. In the south, the US backed Syngman Rhee. Both wanted a unified Korea, on their own terms. Tensions simmered for 5 years, with border clashes and families divided by a line that hadn't existed before. The Korean people, after decades of Japanese rule, were now pawns in a global power struggle. On June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung, believing he had Soviet and Chinese support, launched a massive invasion across the 38th parallel. North Korean tanks and troops overwhelmed the south, aiming to unify the peninsula by force. The world suddenly faced the first major armed conflict of the Cold War. As a line of convenience became the front line of a global shooting. The Korean War had begun, not as a civil war, but as a flashpoint in a divided world. The fate of Korea would be decided far from its own soil. The North Korean invasion stunned the world, and especially the United States. In 1950, America's focus was on Europe, rebuilding after World War II, containing the Soviets, and defending NATO allies. Korea seemed distant and unimportant. Even Secretary of State Dean Acheson left it out of America's offensive. This omission was read by Pyongyang and Moscow as a sign the U.S. might not intervene. Meanwhile, Americans were enjoying post-war prosperity and had little appetite for any distant conflict. The U.S. military was downsized, focused on nuclear deterrence, not ground wars in Asia. Intelligence missed the signs of North Korea's buildup. When the invasion came, it was a shock. Proof that the Cold War could turn hot anywhere, at any time. America's inattention and miscalculation set the stage for a war no one expected. The Korean War would force the world to confront the true stakes of the Cold War. The cost of looking away would be measured in blood. Just a crisis. The early months were disastrous for South Korea and the U.S., forced into a aggression. The trap was set. As UN troops neared the Yalu, China warned it would not tolerate an American-backed army on its border. US leaders dismissed the threat, underestimating China's resolve. In late 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured into North Korea, launching devastating surprise attacks. UN forces, caught off guard and outnumbered, were forced into a brutal winter retreat, the longest in US military history. The war's scope had changed. It was now the US and allies versus China. General MacArthur wanted to escalate, blockade China, bomb its cities, even use nuclear weapons. Truman refused, fearing a wider war with China and the Soviet Union. The clash led to MacArthur's dismissal, reaffirming civilian control over the military. Truman insisted on a limited war, seeking a negotiated settlement, not total victory. The Korean War became the first major conflict of the nuclear age, dangerous, limited, and uncertain. The world had entered a new era of warfare. After China's intervention and MacArthur's firing, the war ground to a halt. The front stabilized near the 38th parallel, with brutal battles over hills and trenches reminiscent of World War I. Peace talks began in 1951 but dragged on for 2 years, stalled by disputes over prisoners of war. Every day of deadlock meant more casualties, fueling frustration at home and on the battlefield. The war's endless nature became a political issue, helping Dwight Eisenhower win the presidency on a promise to end the war. After Stalin's death and new pressure from Eisenhower, a compromise was reached. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed, not a peace treaty, just a ceasefire. A demilitarized zone was established, dividing Korea much as before. The fighting stopped, but the war never officially ended. The legacy, a divided peninsula, unresolved tensions, and a conflict that still shapes global politics. The Korean War ended where it began, unfinished. The armistice froze the conflict and left Korea divided, 2 nations, 2 destinies. In the north, Kim Il-sung built a totalitarian regime, isolated and focused on survival and military. North Korea became in the south, U.S. aid and security allowed for rebuilding, education, and economic growth. South Korea transformed from poverty to prosperity, the miracle on the Han River. The 1980s saw a pro-democracy movement leading to a vibrant democracy and a global cultural influence. Today, the contrast is stark. North and South share languages, and live in different worlds. The shadow of the war shapes every day on the peninsula. The Korean War's impact